Hi, this is Paul. I wanted to do a little bit of talk about Christopher Mastro Pietro and Vervaeke and Kierkegaard. They had a really interesting video with, I don't remember his name, Sweeney, Patrick Sweeney? We'll be on his video soon. But really tremendous conversation, I thought, with John Vervaeke and Christopher Mastro Pietro. And of course, got to meet Christopher at Thunder Bay last year. Really tremendous guy. I had spoken with him over 3 years ago now, and he gave one of the most memorable moments in my randos conversations that I'll just start out with because it very much relates to this whole conversation.
I see the meaning crisis as, by analogy, because that's all I've got. Imagine that we're living in the afterglow of a dying star. You know, to me, that's what the Christian world is to me. That's what that. Now, I mean this in ways that we don't have time to unpack today, but like that's where God lies for me, is that it's that by definition it's somehow continuous with the nature of the self, and that there's some infinite aspect of the self, the kind of infinite aspect that someone like Kierkegaard described, that has been lost to us, that we've been that's now what was formerly continuous is now discontinuous, and that, you know, the loss of that infinite aspect, the loss of the partaking in eternity, for instance, the partaking of eternity of the self that Christ symbolizes, is lost to us. Now, irrevocably, I don't know, right? I'm just describing a feeling. And the dying star analogy is the closest I've come to depicting both the existential despair of the problem and also the magnitude of the problem, right? Because there's nothing obvious to replace the archetypal image of Christ, right? To the West, and I'm speaking within certain boundaries. I want to be clear about that. But there's no obvious substitution for that. It's like every substitution that we grasp at, all it is just a pale. It's the same symbol, but just in different guises. You know, every pseudo sacred or pseudo religious substitution. And this is part of what John and I were talking about in our video, right? Every one that we can find is just you know, that symbol, that archetypal image behind in a different set of vestments, and we see that, right, with the various mythic fads and cultures, and I calling them fads, I mean, I don't mean that they don't have value and import, and the play and the sense of participation that they induce does have value, and insofar as it refers us to the sacral importance of our fundamental symbols, I think that's valuable, because I think it reorients us and points us indexically in the direction that we actually ought to be looking. So insofar as they do that, I think those mythoi, if I can call them that, are valuable. But they're wizened, like they're feeble, and they can't solve anything, because all they are approximations of something that is slowly and gradually receding from us. And that's why that dying star example, it speaks to me so much, because it's such a slow and gradual declension. It's such a slow process, right? And it also taps into that definition of despair as a kind of interminable death or dying, right? The sense of hyperventilation is that you breathe in less air every time, but you're still getting enough to survive. Something is falling away, and so that experience, that sort of notional awareness is something that has come upon me with more potency, I think, even in the last few years than it did in the 10 years prior, you know, because I also when you're an adolescent, I'm speaking generally, when I was an adolescent, I should just speak for myself, you know, I was working on just figuring out who the hell I was and what I could do and what I couldn't and what I loved and what I didn't. So there wasn't as much time for ruminating on things that require you to have a certain integrality in order to even sense them, if that makes any sense. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But I think once I had some of that, then the inkling of the magnitude of that problem started to disclose itself a little bit more to me. And obviously the work that I'm doing with John has facilitated that as well and given it shape and geometry and vocabulary and all that jazz.
Okay, so that image really caught the imagination of a lot of people. The afterglow of a dying star, in the sense that Christianity was just receding. Now that was 3 years ago, and oh, come on, mouse, help me find you. So this conversation with Christopher and John and Andrew Sweeney, I loved it. I really enjoyed this conversation. Very honest, very grappling, and I think so. There are different corners of this corner. Quite obviously, there are some very Christian corners of this corner. Those that feel very at home and comfortable, like myself, in the church, and others who have had different experiences with church, have different postures towards church, are very much looking and thinking. And I'm very excited about the conference coming up in a few weeks, because I think we're going to have a lot of opportunity for people to do exploring and processing with each other. Part of what we're really building into the conference is not just times to hear Jonathan Peugeot and John Vervaeke and myself and John Van Donk. John Van Donk's going to do some talking there, but an opportunity. I hope Christopher's there. Christopher was in Thunder Bay, but more opportunity to talk to people as individuals. And of course, it's tougher to talk to Jonathan and John. A little easier to talk to me. My channel's a little smaller, but still, never enough time, even just in a long weekend. But still, more opportunity to talk and listen and make some connections. But I want to play a little bit of this. I'm tempted to play the whole video because there's a ton of stuff that's worth listening to, I thought, in it, in terms of understanding where people are at with respect to Christianity within this large, diverse world.
I wanted to ask you about that. I wanted to bring in the Christianity bit as well, and think about maybe the sacrifice of Socrates and the sacrifice of Kierkegaard. Socrates having a full life and then drinking the hemlock, whereas Christ dying young in this early death, and I always think about, and then also Kierkegaard dying young.
Now, to tell you what I'm going to do in a little bit, I'm going to play the first chapter of a book that was very helpful for me a number of years ago, trying to get acclimated to Kierkegaard, because Kierkegaard is really hard to read. And the more you know about him, the more you realize just how difficult to read he is by virtue of his biography and his life. And this particular biography begins with his funeral, and with how that author lays out his funeral. It's really helpful to get a sense of how Kierkegaard is an interesting person who in some ways is so broad that he's both an extremely loyal follower of Jesus and a son of the church that is intensely disaffected and also disruptive within the church in Copenhagen in the early part of the 19th century.
I wonder if you guys had any thoughts about that, like Socrates having a full life, being the full sage, and then the Christ figure being the ultimate sort of sacrifice of you at a young period in his life.
It's interesting too, because historically, I want to be very careful that people hear what I'm saying. The literature about these two is interwoven. There's good reason to believe that the Socratic template was taken up by the writers of the gospel, and it influenced how they understood Jesus as the sacrifice. Of course,
that's something I would love to see more of, or at least hear more about, because, for example, in reading The Divine Conspiracy, Dallas Willard, again, it's such a shame that Dallas Willard is no longer around, because, boy, I'll tell you, if we could have gotten him into a conference like at Chino, Dallas Willard taught. He was a phenomenologist. He taught philosophy at USC in Southern California. He wrote The Divine Conspiracy, which was a book that made a lot of impact in my life about 15 years ago when it just came out. Read that book through a couple of times. I've read it a couple of times since then. I think it's a nice treatment of the Sermon on the Mount from Dallas Willard's sort of very interesting perspective. Dallas Willard, in some ways, was a part of this little corner before it was a little corner, and he would have been an amazing inclusion in this.
Also deeply, profoundly influenced by the Jewish, prophetic tradition and the suffering servant and the sacrificial lamb. But one way of thinking about the Christ mythos is that it's a mythos that draws these two together and then makes something new come out of it. And so that's just a way of saying it's really tricky to answer. I think your question is completely good, Andrew. I'm not trying to backhand it in any way, but it's tricky to try and do this comparison because they're not completely separate, and they have this weird, again, the literatures about them have this weird relationship that's really hard to get outside of.
For example, when I've talked about this before, after rereading some of The Divine Conspiracy a couple of years ago, deciding to pick up a copy of Plato's Republic in Greek so that I could do a little. One of the things that you realize if you learn some Greek, even less Hebrew, to wrestle with the Bible in original languages to the degree that you can, you very quickly realize what a difficult thing translation is. And even if you're wrestling with, let's say, Homer, and to try and get a sense of the language and what different translators are doing. And so it was Dallas Willard that sort of made me think about Plato's Republic, or think about the Sermon on the Mount in the light of Plato's Republic and dikaiosune, this word righteousness.
To know where we would stand such that we would try and compare the two together.
Mm-hmm. Well, also I could really relate to Christopher, when you were talking about how you have this intense relationship with Christianity, but you couldn't never fully commit yourself to the faith of Christianity, and feeling the same way, but not wanting to alienate my Christian friends, and really getting a lot of, let's say, richness from the Christian tradition, but without being able to fully commit myself to it on some level. So I feel the same way about that as you were speaking of, Christopher.
I appreciate you saying that. And yeah, I think we've touched on that before, Andrew. Yeah. So I'm recollecting that as you say it. And we are definitely not alone. Like, in some ways it has become,
someone's at the front door.
I don't know, it's hard to trace this historically, but at least if it wasn't always, it has become absurdly enough, it's become one of the defining characteristics of being a Christian, or being a particular kind of Christian, is being caught in that predicament. And one of Kierkegaard was someone who helped me to appreciate and understand that predicament much better, and to not think of it more pathologically than is necessary, right? And it's a particular, John and I have been talking about this a lot lately, and one of the things that I'm coming to more and more is I'm starting to be able to rest in ambivalence a little bit more, to realize that I'm neither here nor there, and that I'm halfway somewhere, and I'm always halfway somewhere, and to pause there instead of constantly being fitful about it, constantly trying to break out of it by force, as if such a thing were possible, and to just sit in it for a minute and wonder about it, and wonder at it in the Socratic sense of wonder about the ambivalence, wonder that I am neither here nor there. And one of the ways of understanding, I think, the pains of being a certain kind of modern Christian is quite analogous to the pains of being a self in the way that Kierkegaard describes it, which is that you have it or you are it, right? There's always an implicit modal confusion there, which even comes out in the language. I am it, but I can't quite become it, but I can't not be it, right? It's a mind-bending experience to realize that you're sort of fit, you come pre-fitted with something that you can't quite espouse and you also can't do away with.
Mm-hmm.
And
I have a hard time articulating it better than he just did. Now, and even, this is what's so strange for people, is because you rightly would look at me and say, good grief, Vanderklay, you're a third generation minister in the Christian Reformed Church. If you would tell me I was going to stop going to church every week for Sunday, I'd say not a chance. I'd go more often during the week. I in some ways I look over at the Catholics with daily mass and think, yeah, that's not a bad way to go. Yet there's always a sort of okay, how do we fit? How does this work? How are we settled? And to have all of these three guys so Christopher, with his connection to the church, say, a la Kierkegaard. And of course, Kierkegaard, as we'll get into, is a tremendously interesting person with respect to this because, wow, plus Lutheran, not Roman Catholic. Andrew Sweeney, living in France, early Rando's conversation with him, exploring Buddhism, some of these things, has continued to do his YouTube channel and his writing, his blogging. He was doing, a variety of blogging. Of course, John Vervaeke, many of us know his story. And I mentioned in previous videos that, one of the things that I've been pondering about is, in fact, the relationship of Christendom and the church and how on earth we think about Christendom, because we might think about medieval Europe as being deep Christendom. How many people were actually attending Mass? And of course, the transformation that happens in the Protestant Reformation, where now suddenly in Geneva, you're trying to get the whole town to be holy, and the Puritans working really hard. I mean, if you were in a Puritan colony or a Puritan city, the Puritans getting really hard to try to get everybody in church regularly, and thinking about schools with chapels and compulsory chapel, and thinking about the UK experience of a state church and the American experience of not having a federal state church and then having state churches of various states for a while, and then them basically this secular society. And it's really quite a thing to try and wrap one's head around. And then adding in Tom Holland's definition of Christianity and understanding the deeply Christian connections in a secular society now that modernity is receding, and suddenly, sort of like in Mono Lake, which is this lake on the other side of the Sierra, when Southern California started taking the water out from the streams that were contributing to Mono Lake, this great salt lake, and the lake level went down, exposing all these tufa exhibits. I mean, this is a lot of what we're seeing now with the recession of modernity. We're seeing all of these structures that are deeply the product of Christianity. And once you take away the living faith from them, what to do with those institutions? I just posted that video with James Orr with his wonderful conversation on trigonometry. And so trying to get a handle on this. And then each of us, a critical element of a spiritual home is, in fact, the people you share a home with. In many respects, if you're living alone, you're not in a home, you're just in a house. And so part of what we've constructed is, of course, John and Christopher have been, deep partners. I think for both of them, that they would be spiritual roommates in a sense in the home they're constructing. But part of what you get in an actual local church with local people who are sharing life together for decades is you get much more of a sense of home, even if you're seeing each other only 2, 3, 4 times a week, or connecting only 2, 3, 4 times a week. So there's so many layers to this.
I think he understood that experience, and he understood the uncanniness of that experience and how painful it is to be a thing and to be also non-identical with it.
Well, maybe it's to love it and then see the simulacrum of it, and be so offended by the simulacrum of it that you couldn't go there. You couldn't go to church and be with these people who are proclaiming to be Christians and are coming short of living that idea.
And, if you'll follow my Romans class, a deep part of this is in Christianity, this disconnect that the Apostle Paul really puts into it right away, where on one hand, it's a modal question. We are in Christ. We have been crucified with Christ, united with him in his baptism, united with him in his death, united with him in his resurrection. And at the same time, we are continuing to decay. We have not yet arrived. This tension that you see, especially in a book like 1 Corinthians, where 1st and 2nd Corinthians, where you've got this real conflict between Paul and this community. They're doing things and living in ways that Paul looks at and says, this is so far from the gospel. In many respects, what he says of the Eucharist with them, or what will become the Eucharist, is it'd almost be better if you stop doing this, because what you're doing is just so destructive and wrong. Yet at the same time, he'll turn around and he'll say, you are a new creation. And so much of this modal management is what we're grappling with.
Kierkegaard is an intense critic of Christendom.
Yeah,
very much so. And boy, there's so much to say.
Chris, you and I've talked about this, and I'm unsure about how to go forward because I don't want to trespass on the confidentiality of our profound friendship. But I mean, I think you are a Socratic Christian in the sense that you grasp the Socratic metaxu and eros, and then you embody Christianity within that matrix, and that is actually the proper way to be a Socratic self. That's a long way of saying it, but did that make sense to you? As
That's beautiful, John. Yeah, it does. I would like to be that. It sounds aspirational. It sounds like the kind of thing that if I could attain it, I would have attained a harmonious relationship with it. And I don't always feel like I have the harmony that you described.
But you're doing it. You hear what you're saying? You're saying, I'm not wise. I'm a lover of that wisdom, which is Socratic through and through. You're doing it. You're saying if anyone...
And again, back to Paul. I'm certainly not fully formed in the image of Christ, but I am seeking it. It's this dislocation, but there's a tension in that dislocation.
If anyone stands before you and says, I am a Christian, and takes that, right? I mean, some people, that just means I carry a card within a belief cult of some kind, right?
Yeah.
Putting that aside, but in the Kierkegaardian sense, like if you would assert that, you're involved. It's like saying I'm wise. You're engaged in a kind of profound performative contradiction. That if you remove the aspiration to Christ-likeness from Christianity and think it is something that is somehow complete or resolved, then you actually lose the core of Christianity. That's what I mean about a Socratic Christianity.
Right.
I mean, I don't want to impose on you, and I don't want to draw you into anything that is. But I also
I know quite a number of people who I consider to be very kind of profound Christians who can't find their way in the institutional mode of Christianity. I think that's and those are the people I often think are more Christian in some ways.
That's exactly what I'm saying. Yeah. If I look out at people that I think I want to say are Christians, and I mean this in with reverence. I think of Chris as an exemplar of what I think a Christian should be, and I'm not trying to ruin him into anything. I'm not a Christian, and I'm not trying, I'm not doing that. I'm not. I think the thing that you're saying, Chris, is actually I think it's a profound way in which Christianity could be deeply, authentically viable for many people today who cannot see that viability within what remains of Christendom. That's what I want to say.
And now, when I get to Kierkegaard in this biography, you're going to see that's deeply there, yet there still remains a tension there. For example, someone could claim to be just the best father, but never in the home. Well, how does that work? So we have to wrestle with these modes, and we have to wrestle with individualism, because a lot of this sort of comes through individualism, because a big part of Christianity is, again, being part of the body. And it's, you cannot read the Gospel of John, a new command I give to you, that you love one another, if there's not a stable one another to love, because that stable one another to love back and forth is in fact the platform that is created by the faithfulness, and that is intended not only to give the people within that group the space for expression and devotion and practice. Now remember, we're talking about a group of people who are talking about an ecology of practices, not just propositions, but all 4 P's. And so on one hand, it can be very, and again, Kierkegaard sets this up for us in many, many ways, yet as you'll hear in some of the biography that I'm going to play, you have to wrestle with this with him. Because on one hand, you can say, yes, there is the image. But in many respects, this image comes to us from Christ himself. Because Christ himself was not just one of the other disciples, even though he says, he calls them friends. And that's not a small thing for Christ to say. I'm your friend. And, of course, in Christians, we have what a friend we have in Jesus. That's a deeply important thing to say in the Greco-Roman world. If we want to bring some of the broader world into the gospel environment. Okay, so this is the book by Stephen Backhouse. It's called Kierkegaard, A Life. And I read this book a number of years ago. I found it on the Christianity Today recommended books series. And, after struggling to read some Kierkegaard and come to terms with it, I read this book. It helped me immensely. I haven't heard it mentioned in the series, but I think it'll probably help many of you.
Once upon a time, my colleague Lincoln Harvey asked me for a book on the life and thought of Søren Kierkegaard he could read on holiday. I gave him what I had on the shelf. Upon his return, Harvey, an Anglican priest, teacher, and theologian of considerable insight, confessed he had not been able to get through the first chapter. The Kierkegaard he met seemed dense, distant, and unappealing. I knew then that if a disciple of Karl Barth and minister in the established Church of England had thought Kierkegaard was irrelevant to him, then something indeed had gone spectacularly wrong. This was the spur for this book. Lincoln is not alone. It is not just theologians who find the influence of Kierkegaard hovering behind much of their work, only to find the life and thought of the man himself hard to get to know. Journalists, philosophers, artists, novelists, musicians, psychologists, pastors, politicians, playwrights, therapists, anthropologists, filmmakers, culture critics, historians, and teachers, or anyone affected by these professions, also occasionally stumble across this strange 19th century Danish name, pronounced Søren Kierkegaard, and wonder what's up. To make matters more confusing, Kierkegaard's influence seems to transcend any one of the spheres in which he is encountered. Modernists are suspicious of this apparently postmodern thinker who never said anything directly and wrote mostly under pseudonyms. Postmodernists love the multiple voices, but are suspicious of his stubborn adherence to revealed truth with a capital T. Religious people hear Kierkegaard as the father of existentialism and suspect he is a secular atheist. Secular atheists steer clear when they hear Kierkegaard lies behind the popular idea of a leap of faith. Christian apologists love his attack on the idolatry of scientific rationality, but they are less keen on his attack on Christian apologetics. Liberals appreciate his love for the common man and his insights into the vapid nature of market-driven media and politics, but don't like his trenchant critique of social solutions to individual problems, or the present age's delusional belief in historical progress. Conservatives draw much from Kierkegaard's highly Christian focus on the liberty of the individual, but do not like that he finds the main enemies of this liberty to be Christian culture and much that is called traditional family values. Whatever your take on modern life, there are two true things that can be said about Kierkegaard. His influence on our various modes of thought is widespread, and the exact nature of this influence is difficult to articulate.
And this is what I've seen from many. There are some of you out there who really do not like Kierkegaard. Others of you love him. And in this little corner, Kierkegaard has sort of been in this space. Just listening now to Christopher's conversation with me, I remember the conversation. That's why I pulled it up. I remember his image of this receding sun. Didn't remember that right there in that conversation, he mentioned Kierkegaard.
There are a handful of biographies of Kierkegaard. The books by Walter Lowry, 1938, Josiah Thompson, 1973, Alistair Hannay, 2001, and Joachim Garf, Danish, 2000, English translation 2005, are all excellent in their own right. Lowry's was the first. It was designed to introduce the Dane to an unknowing public, and as such, reprints large tracts of Kierkegaard's own words, at that time found nowhere else. Besides being perhaps less engaging now than Lowry intended then, the book also mines Kierkegaard's pseudonymous material for biographical data in a way that is now questionable. Thompson's highly readable biography is the most literary, but he is not a Kierkegaardian scholar, and he largely skates over the content of the authorship. Furthermore, his book, which set out to be a corrective of sorts to Lowry's hagiography, takes enormous strides into amateur psychology few Kierkegaardians now wish to follow. Hannay and Garf are meticulous in their detail and exhaustive in their dissection of Kierkegaard's life and thought. Theirs are monumental, substantial, and indeed indispensable pieces of work for Kierkegaardian specialists. The world does not need another academic biography of Søren Kierkegaard. What it can use is something for educated non-specialists who do not need to know and do not care about the depths of Kierkegaard's intellectual
And I think this is part of the value of this particular book.
development or the minutiae of his cultural context in Golden Age Denmark. Søren's life had many dramatic, romantic, melancholic, and humorous twists and turns, well known to experts, but perhaps less well known to normal readers. What is more, Kierkegaard stands as an influence on some of the most important, life-giving, and controversial developments in the modern age. As Charles Williams correctly predicted, his sayings will be so moderated in our minds that they will soon become not his sayings, but ours. Kierkegaard has become a part of our culture, whether we acknowledge it or not. As it stands, only academics
That's, of course, Charles Williams of the Inklings.
tend to know this. What a shame. What a waste. It is worth trying to redress the balance. Kierkegaard led an interesting life, but ultimately it was the life of a prolific author. Inevitably, any account of his life will involve a fair amount of writing about writing. Some of this material is highly technical, and I am well aware it has the potential to clog up the narrative. On the other hand, it is only because of his ideas we know him at all, and some people care more about his books than his life. To that end, I have largely separated biographical discussion from discussion of his works. The present volume contains short overviews of every one of Kierkegaard's published books, both in his lifetime and posthumously. This material is clearly demarcated from the rest of the text and can be easily ignored or accessed as the listener prefers. A word of confession and warning. Kierkegaard himself was disdainful of the practice of overviews. He wrote specifically to avoid summarization, and is all the better for it. If you use these overviews to avoid engaging with the real thing, then it may be small comfort to know the only person Kierkegaard dislikes more than you is me. Kierkegaard can be hard work. My overviews are meant to help orient the biographical listener. They are invariably also my interpretation. You must read the originals and decide for yourself. Another warning, it might change your life. I know he changed mine.
So that's a good overview. Got the acknowledgments.
A controversial life. The new bishop stands at the window, looking at the crowd milling in the courtyard below. He cranes his neck, trying to get a better view of the church door opposite, but it is difficult. He cannot see, but at the same time he does not want to be seen. That would never do. The bishop has pushed himself to the limits of his reputation to avoid any connection to the distasteful funeral going on across the way. Yet he knows, along with all of Copenhagen, that the events below are all anyone is talking about. They will be in all the papers tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. It is of paramount importance that these papers record that the newly minted bishop of all Denmark, Hans L. Martensen, shepherd to the nation, was not present at the burial of his former student, now the scourge of all Christendom, Søren Kierkegaard.
That gives you a little taste of what is to come. And the fact that, so here you have Christendom. And if we think about what we've said about attention, within Christendom, now this is Lutheran Christendom. He has a great section on sort of the religious climate of the time. All of the attention, of course, everyone's a Christian, as it were, except those who are, you've got Christians of all different styles. Maybe we should jump ahead and perhaps do some of that. It's going to be a little hard to find.
Martensen had good reason to expect heightened public interest. All of Denmark's respectable papers, as well as her less respectable but more popular magazines, had been providing a steady drip of comment on the events leading up to and following Søren's passing. The details of his life, after all, were irresistible to any journalist worthy of the name. An enigmatic, brilliant loner with more than a whiff of scandal about him, Søren Kierkegaard had long enjoyed the reputation as something of a dangerous dandy about town. Every literate citizen, and more than a few who did not read at all, had an opinion. Sophisticated, artistic citizens recognized his talent, even if they did not actually understand his books. He was the kind of author who it was important either to be seen to be reading or to pointedly ignore. Morally upright citizens admitted he was a good writer, but was he a good man? The constant trips to the theater and the flagrant gallivanting about town with all sorts suggested an absence of moral fiber.
Now it's interesting. You almost have sort of a Batman vibe, where, of course, Bruce Wayne is supposed to be a playboy, and the Christopher Nolan movies about Batman bring this out. He's this playboy, he's irresponsible, but of course he's got this other side. And so Kierkegaard has all of these sides, and of course he's going to do so much of his writing through pseudonyms, and there's just conceit within conceit, and he's simply playing with all of the pretense. Now, I think in many ways this is lost to many who are not in a deeply conservative Christian community, because of course that is the arena that one can play these games on. And if, like today, you've got much more of a sense of a chaotic marketplace of ideas, well, then suddenly you're twisting on whatever dogmas and pretense the current marketplace is promoting.
Didn't Søren despise his brother Peter Christian, and didn't he refuse his brother to even attend at his deathbed? In any case, Peter, so earnest and plodding, almost certainly hated his brilliant and infamous younger sibling. Religious citizens remembered him as the promising theologian who spoke and wrote endlessly about Christianity, and yet who did not become a pastor, and now never even went to church. Romantic citizens vaguely suspected this stillborn church career was somehow connected to the scandal of his broken engagement years before. "Such a sweet young girl," they would whisper to each other, "and taken off by her new husband to the West Indies. It's almost like they were escaping something, or someone." Older citizens of Copenhagen would shake their heads and say they always knew Søren would come to a bad end. There was something not quite right about his father, Michael. He was a miserable old miser. And the timing of Michael's second marriage to Søren's mother, so soon after the death of his first wife, was positively scandalous. And she was the maid.
And if you go into the book, you'll read that, in fact, these elements of his family of origin are deeply formative.
Younger citizens knew him from the caricatures and cartoons the satirical magazine The Corsair was always churning out. a magazine that they would hastily sneak a peek at when their more respectable elders were not looking. These respectable citizens knew him as the one the King of Denmark had marked out for special favor. Less respectable citizens either knew of Søren as the one who stopped to talk to them on his walks about town, or as the one they threw stones at as he passed. Student citizens knew his first name, when attached to a character in a comedy review, would automatically get laughs. For the same reason, pregnant citizens took this name off their list of potential baby names. The novelists of Denmark's golden age, including Hans Christian Andersen, anticipated and yet dreaded Søren's reviews of their latest works. Poets and playwrights admired the man who wrote provocative fiction. Philosophers read him for his statements on the nature of time, existence, and the meaning of life. Conservatives liked Søren for his opposition to democracy and revolution. Liberals liked Søren for his championing of the individual and the common man against the forces of inherited tradition. Atheists loved his attacks on the clergy and official religion of Christendom. Reformers, longing for a renewal of Christianity in the land, also loved his attacks on the clergy and official religion of Christendom. Clearly, this was a man of sharp contradictions and puzzling paradoxes. But all the citizens agreed that he was rich. Wasn't he rich? He must be rich.
Now, again, just in that paragraph, you see all of the contradictions within him. Again, conservatives liked Søren for his opposition to democracy and revolution. Just pause there. Is he a monarchist? Kierkegaard? Liberals liked Søren for his champion of the individual and the common man against the forces of inherited tradition. Atheists loved his attack on the clergy and the official religion of Christendom. Reformers longed for renewal of Christianity in the land and loved his attack on the clergy and the official religion of Christendom. So here you have all of this, and part of what's interesting about all of this is that this is deeply embedded in the arena of golden age Copenhagen, I don't know how to say these Danish words, and this Lutheran church that prizes respectability. And now we're in an age which is so very different. It's one thing to sort of buck the church when the church is large and in charge. It's another thing to buck the church when churches are hardly able to be found.
To whom will he leave all his money? So it is that when on Friday, November 16, 1855, Denmark's most venerable newspaper announced, on the evening of Sunday, the 11th of this month, after an illness of 6 weeks, Dr. Søren Åbye Kierkegaard was taken from this earthly life in his 43rd year by a calm death, which hereby is sorrowfully announced on his own behalf of the rest of the family by his brother, Peter Christian Kierkegaard. It did so with the full knowledge that enclosed in these simple lines raged a storm that threatened to spill out onto the quiet streets of Copenhagen and beyond. Or so they must have hoped. All these citizens had to get and share their opinions somewhere, after all. It was a good time to be a journalist. If the editors who wrote the bare outlines of the story did hope for someone else to provide the color commentary, they were not disappointed. Other public figures were not reticent to opine on Søren's passing. Writing in the periodical North and South, an editor and journalist, and himself not without literary ambitions, Aaron Goldschmidt spoke up for many of Kierkegaard's admirers. He was, without a doubt, one of the greatest intellects Denmark has produced, but he died a timely death because his most recent activities had begun to gain him precisely the sort of popularity that he could never have harmonized with his personality. The most dangerous part of his actions against the clergy and the official church is now only just beginning, because his fate undeniably has something of the martyr about it.
Now again, we're talking a very different time and space than this. I'm against the church. Get in line. What church? What state church? Now it's sort of the state church of wokeism or some other imagined institution.
The Jewish Goldschmidt was writing outside the walls of the established church. Key figures of Danish Christianity were less distraught about Søren's passing and more certain about his status as a Christian hero. Namely, he was nothing of the kind. The celebrated pastor Nikolai Grundtvig, a cultural and ecclesial giant in Danish life then and now, also spoke for many when he preached a sermon on the day of Kierkegaard's burial, giving thanks that one of the icicles hanging from the church roof had now melted and fallen off. In a letter to a friend, Grundtvig said of Kierkegaard, "I do not wonder that he was surprised by death, for as long as the day of the Antichrist has not yet come, those who tinker with the national church will always come to grief, and quickly, just like false messiahs."
And again, for this secular public square that we currently have, Billy Graham was, in a sense, in the United States, sort of the last major Christian figure. So you might say, well, Rick Warren, who prayed at Obama's first but not second inaugural. Remember the Giglio affair with respect to same-sex marriage and evangelicalism at Obama's second inaugural. So in some ways, Kierkegaard seems very of the moment, but in a very different time.
To be labeled a great intellect, martyr, and false messiah all at once was no mean feat. But it was not only the religious and literary establishments that had their points of view. The scientific fraternity also made its voice heard. Kierkegaard was, evidently, a medical marvel, according to a group of research students who complained about the decision to bury Søren. He should, they said, have been given an autopsy instead of a traditional burial. A mighty brain like Søren's deserved to be preserved for science. That the engine which powered such a literary output and such a quirky personality should molder in the ground like any common man was a travesty to research. They complained to the hospital, but the hospital acquiesced to the wishes of the family. This was much to the relief of one of Søren's friends who had been present at the petition and who wrote in his memoirs, "I thought it decent of the hospital, but those who were enthusiasts of science did not think that sort of thing should be taken into consideration." Decency won out. But speculation over the contents of Kierkegaard's skull remained. He was said to suffer from a softness of the brain, wrote one of Søren's committed enemies. Was this responsible for his writings, or were the writings responsible for it? Here was the rub. It was Søren's writings, especially the writings which made up the final stage of his life and career, which lay at the root of all the fuss. This collection of pamphlets and newspaper articles are now known collectively as Kierkegaard's attack upon Christendom, and it was while engaged in this attack that Søren died. It was precisely because of these writings that Søren's admirers and enemies alike agreed that he absolutely should not be laid to rest in a traditional manner. And it was precisely because of these writings that many of Søren's family desperately wished that he would. Søren had said he wanted to upset blind habits and overturn easy assumptions. In this, if nothing else, he had succeeded. His niece, Henriette Lund, was present at the house following her uncle's death. She paints a picture of a family torn between private grief and public responsibility. No one was thinking clearly about the future, but were, she says, living minute by minute in the present. As a result, no one made definite arrangements for the funeral, and each was leaving the decisions up to the others. There had to be a funeral, but when and where should it take place? If it took place quietly, then it would look like the family was ashamed of Søren and his life's work, which was all anyone was talking about at this time anyway. On the other hand, as Søren's nephew and younger half-brother to Henrietta Troels Frederick notes in his memoirs, a traditional church funeral would have struck a strongly discordant note. Troels summarized the quandary well. Everyone knew that the deceased had characterized pastors as liars, deceivers, perjurers, quite literally without exception. Not one honest pastor.
Remember when Jordan Peterson was talking about lying pastors?
Søren had publicly stated more than once that the comfortable, civilized world of cultural Danish Christendom had done away with Christianity. He had repeatedly denied he was even a Christian, and upon his deathbed he had sent away his ordained brother, refusing to receive communion from a clergyman. And now the expectation was that Søren was to be given a full funeral from this self-same established Lutheran Danish church. The unsavory rabble who liked Søren's attack and the sophisticated clergy who bore the brunt of it agreed alike that this would be impossible. Yet Søren was the brother of a pastor, the son of a publicly minded churchman, the friend of bishops. What is more, despite his later offensive statements, anyone even slightly familiar with Søren's work could see that his was no simplistic attack on all things holy. He never stopped invoking the name of Jesus Christ in all his works. Surely it was still a Christian heart that stopped beating when the caustic public persona died in its hospital bed. The way forward was not clear, and the family dithered. According to Henrietta, it was probably in this way that some things were decided by mere chance. For example, the choice of the day of the funeral. This should not have been allowed to fall on a Sunday. Henrietta reports that a number of clergy came to Søren's brother, her Uncle Peter, to get him to change the date.
And again, there you see the Christendom context. But it's just the most incredible story.
But Peter, doubtless with one eye on the inevitable newspaper report, thought that a change would look like cowardice. And so the arrangements went ahead as planned. Peter settled the decision to bury on a Sunday in Denmark's mother church, the Church of Our Lady, and he would deliver the eulogy himself. On November 20...
Now, even with that, so here's the church, there's the church. But even with that, you see many of the contemporary questions in terms of public scandal, media, public opinion. I mean, the whole generation and growth of public opinion. What on earth is that? How is that gauged? How does the body of the public live with respect to the organs that at that point are newspapers and magazines? You don't yet, of course, have radio or television or anything of this nature. There's Hans Christian Andersen.
Before 1855, Hans Christian Andersen wrote to a friend about the funeral and its aftermath. His observations helped set the stage for the whole scenario as it played itself out. Søren Kierkegaard was buried last Sunday, November 18, following a service at the Church of Our Lady. The parties concerned had done very little. The church pews were closed, and the crowd in the aisles was unusually large. Ladies in red and blue hats were coming and going. Item: a dog with a muzzle. At the graveside itself there was a scandal. When the whole ceremony was over out there, that is, when Dean Tried had cast earth upon the casket, a son of a sister of the deceased stepped forward and denounced the fact that he had been buried in this fashion. He declared, this was the point, more or less, that Søren Kierkegaard had resigned from our society, and therefore we ought not bury him in accordance with our customs. I was not there, but it was said to be unpleasant. The newspapers say a little about it. In Fatherland's issue of last Thursday, this nephew has published his speech along with some concluding remarks. To me, the entire affair is a distorted picture of Søren K. I don't understand it. Andersen was not alone, either in his confusion or in his opinion that with the crowds, colorful hats, muzzled dogs, and graveside protests, the whole affair had been grossly mishandled. Every eyewitness to the scene comments on the packed building, with funereal tourists describing the enormous crowd present at the service where the church was full to bursting. Many had to be content with their spot of floor space behind a column in the back.
You know, it's almost as if you were burying a Cardassian or someone who was, or Milo Yiannopoulos or Kanye West. And again, I wanted to bring this into the conversation because this tension of inside, outside, was this man even a Christian, or was he the best Christian? People, Jordan Peterson is the best kind of Christian. I mean, you'll get comments, Jordan Peterson's a better Christian than you. Okay. And John Vervaeke too. Oh, okay.
Before they were all locked down, Søren's adolescent nephew Troels did manage to find a seat in the pew row immediately behind the family. A man who I later heard was Professor Rasmus Nielsen sat in the pew with me and closed the door to the box pew so hard that it locked shut. Nielsen, who fancied himself Kierkegaard's disciple and successor, was one of the many people there with mixed motives. Poor Henrietta Lund, there to grieve for her beloved uncle, was overwhelmed by a gang of gawkers who pushed their way into the church. The scene she relates was one of a ceremony on the verge of chaos, much like a restless mob waiting for something, anything, to happen. The tightly packed mass of people surged like an angry sea, she wrote. while a ring of rather unpleasant-looking characters had placed themselves around the small, flower-decked coffin. This group was largely composed of self-declared supporters of Søren, upset that with this funeral the church was attempting to absorb into its own one of its most outspoken opponents. It looked like this group of toughs was going to carry the day, when suddenly the church door burst open and a smaller group of completely different appearance pushed themselves through the crowd in order.
It's almost gang warfare here, and so here you've got these toughs, and now these students are going to come in, and they're going to prevail.
To grace Denmark's great thinker to his grave with an honor guard around his coffin. These were students from the university, also supporters of Kierkegaard, but with a sense of propriety their comrades lacked. They conquered the space, Henrietta tells us, and their ring replaced the other like a solid wall. The gang of ruffians, convinced the brightest and best stars of the Danish church were going to whitewash Søren's legacy with an outpouring of self-serving, Christianized verbiage, need not have worried. In the end, all clergy refused to speak. A rumor went about that this was at the behest of Bishop Martinsen. The mutual animosity between Martinsen and Kierkegaard was well known, however. His decision here, if indeed it was his decision, was not solely due to petty foibles. The church was in a bind. If pastors spoke harshly of Søren, it would be taken as speaking badly of the dead. If they praised him, it would seem they agreed with his notorious attack, or worse, were angling for money from the family.
And again, you almost have this Jesus quality, or the Socratic quality, where, well, the Arenic establishment just does not know what to do with this man.
So it was that only 2 members of the clergy were present in their official vestments. Tride, the old dean of Our Lady, was there because he had to be. Visibly uncomfortable, Tride bustled about, pushing his little cap back and forth on his head at a feverish pace, while his face, usually so benign, wore an expression of profound annoyance. The other clergyman present in his robes was Peter Kierkegaard. He may have been wearing the vestments of his vocation, but when he took his place at the front of the church, he did so not as a priest, but as a brother. Nephew Trolls noted, perhaps with some surprise considering Peter's earlier dithering and known antipathy towards Søren, that his uncle's eulogy was powerfully delivered. Other witnesses to the event agree the elder brother was gentle and calm, without directly alluding to the most recent polemics. The eulogy was not published in full until 1881, which by then was a reconstruction of Peter's own memories in any case. In his reconstruction, Peter tells us he expressed regret that he did not convince Søren to take rest from his labors or to collect himself calmly. Peter talked about their father growing up on the moors of Jutland, how he had loved all his 7 children intensely, and how he, Peter, was now the only one left. He did not think this was the time or place to discuss Søren's actions. However, Peter stated plainly that he did not agree with his brother, and that Søren did not realize he had gone too far. Finally, Peter said he could not thank the gathered mass on behalf of his brother, pointing out that, after all, Søren had always sought solitude instead of being part of a herd. Showing some of his brother's propensity for honest confrontation, Peter went one further. He could not thank the crowd on behalf of the Kierkegaard family either, because he suspected that the crowd was there for mixed motives and wished only to see a spectacle. Peter ended with a prayer that Søren's prodigious efforts would not be misunderstood, and that what was true in them would have a positive effect on the church. Henrietta tells us that when her living uncle delivered the eulogy for her dead one, the restless crowd became still as glass. Old Dean Tride, in his fussy clerical garb, proved less able to preserve the peace when the crowd spilled outside and down the road for the Graveside burial service. Tride was swept along with the throng, whose members were once again jostling for a place with a view. Young Trolls was also caught up in the crush. Everywhere teemed with the tightly packed crowd, which surged over the graves and the latticework fences forward to its common goal. He arrived, breathless, with the rest of the mob at the gravesite. He saw that the freshly dug earth formed a yellow-gray hill, in striking contrast with the green grass growing under the iron railing surrounding the plot. This fence had been removed to give access to the grave, and the crowd pushed and shoved over the yellowy mud, trampling the grass. Everyone assembled, the dean cleared his throat and began the liturgy of committal. Lovet vure Gud o Herre Jesus Christus, the blessing of God the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, faltered on Tride's lips. One person had broken free and was standing in front of the crowd. From his vantage point, Trolls saw a tall, pale young man dressed in black. The man, nervous, looked around and shouted for permission to say a word. "In the name of God, one moment, gentlemen, if you will permit me." What was this? The dean complained that as the man was not ordained, he was not allowed to speak. Tride thought it was all highly irregular and deeply offensive. He was right, but the crowd had not come all this way to see a quiet funeral for an ordinary man. They shouted Tride down and clamored their approval of the interloper. Let him speak. His name was Henrik Lund. He was unknown to many of the people looking on, but it soon transpired that he was yet another nephew of the dead man, one who also happened to be a doctor at the hospital where Søren had died. "I am bound to him by blood ties," said Henrik, "and I am tied to him, finally, by agreement with his views and opinions, and this is perhaps the strongest tie." Henrik drew a breath. "He, my deceased friend, stands and falls with his writings, but I have not heard them mentioned with a single word. Therefore let us investigate here whether his views are true or not." The crowd stayed silent, expectant. It would never happen in a Jewish society, and never among the Turks and Mohammedans, that a member of their society who had left it so decisively would, after his death, and without any prior recantation of his views, nevertheless be viewed as a member of that society. "No," cried Henrik, "this crime against honesty is a crime reserved for official Christianity to commit." Henrik wondered
What an observation.
how far the clergy were going to go in their lip service to Kierkegaard. He insinuated that they were only angling for a good fee because they had heard that Søren was rich. If he had been poor, then the clergy would have treated this service differently. All eyes must have turned then to Tride, unlucky representative of all of Christendom, who stood silently, service book quivering in his hand. "What is this official Christianity, then?" asked the doctor, answering his own question with a quote from the book of Revelation. "It is the great whore Babylon, with whom all the kings of the earth have fornicated, the wine of whose whoredom has made drunk all the peoples of the earth. Therefore the deceased was also right when, at the end of his life, he so urgently and incisively said what must be said, namely that everyone, by ceasing to participate in the official worship of God as it currently is, will always have one sin fewer, and a great sin, namely the sin of participating in making a fool of God by calling the Christianity of the New Testament what is not the Christianity of the New Testament." Henrik concluded with a final flourish. "Therefore, both on his behalf and my own, I protest viewing our presence here as participation in the worship of God sponsored by official Christianity. I have spoken and freed my spirit."
Now remember, these are Lutherans. And in some ways, the spirit of Luther continues to pervade this. Luther, this Alistair McGrath, after Sunday school, one of the participants said, "Can you give me the name of a book to read on the Protestant Reformation?" I was like, oh gosh, because this is a lay person. And I thought, how about Alistair McGrath's Luther's Dangerous Idea? Because there it is. So Kierkegaard is doing what Luther has done. Now, of course, century later, once Luther's position is right there.
Some of the crowd yelled, "Bravo!" and here and there voices called out, "Down with the clergy!" But mostly there was only scattered applause. Trolls tells us that most of the people stood in tense, silent expectation of what would happen now. The young man expected a riot, a great shout, something, but nothing happened. The speaker was gone. I saw the heavy man from the church pew, Rasmus Nielsen, whom I had again discovered near the grave, and who had probably wanted to speak out there, depart with an annoyed expression on his face. If anyone present noticed the irony that the events surrounding the funeral of Denmark's most articulate champion of individuality had largely been dictated by an awkward, shuffling mob, they kept their counsel to themselves. Newspaper comment in the days following was muted, treating the affair briefly and carefully, as if, said one of Søren's friends, they were afraid of getting their fingers burnt. The most scathing assessments were reserved for private consumption. They centered less on Brother Peter's prayer that Søren's words would not be misunderstood, and more on Brother Peter's ham-fisted preparations and on Søren's gauche supporters. Bishop Martinson had adroitly kept himself from public engagement with the Kierkegaard clan, but that did not stop him from commenting archly in a private letter, "Today, after a service at the Church of Our Lady, Kierkegaard was buried. There was a large cortege of mourners. I understand the cortege was composed primarily of young people and a large number of obscure personages. There were no dignitaries, unless one wishes to include R. Nielsen. We have scarcely seen the equal of the tactlessness shown by his family in having him buried on a Sunday between two religious services from the nation's most important church." The presumptuous Dr. Lund did not escape notice either. "I still have not been informed about this through official channels, but it has caused a great offense, which as far as I can see must be met with serious steps." The next year, on June 5, 1856, Henrik Lund was fined 100 riksdaler for this illegal speech. He also had to apologize to Dean Eggert Tride and the Congregation of Our Lady for his egregious assault upon the honor of the nation's most important church. Henrik Lund was concerned about more than just preserving the truth of his uncle's spiritual and literary reputation. The vexed matter of Søren's reputed riches would not go away either. Some of the public may have been reticent to pick sides in Søren's war on Christendom, but they were not shy in speculating about what might have happened to the wealth of this middle-class bachelor. In the weeks following Søren's death, there was a rumor going about that all his money was to be given to the poor. Others wondered whether pots of coins were left lying under the mounds of papers and books in his literary abode. The fact was that no one had yet discovered what Kierkegaard wanted done with his possessions, as Henrik knew full well. As a self-proclaimed guardian of his uncle's legacy, Lund had accompanied the probate secretary on a visit to the house, where he claims to have found a great quantity of paper, mostly manuscripts, located in various places. They found a lot of books, but no will and no money. Indeed, from inspecting his accounts, it seems that Søren had spent all his living on these books, on household expenses, and on people in need. There was nothing left over. In a letter to his brother, Lund wrote with exasperation, "If anyone wants to talk about the great fortune he left behind, just let them talk." Peter Kierkegaard also made a visit to the house. If he was looking for a plain document that would clear up any confusion, or perhaps a letter that would heal brotherly wounds, he too was sorely disappointed. In a locked drawer of Søren's writing desk, Peter found not one will and testament, but two. Both letters came with firm instructions that they were to be opened only after Søren's death. Both letters were addressed to Peter, yet neither had Peter as their subject. One letter was dated 4 years previous. It did not contain a single word of reproachment, but instead read simply, "The unnamed person, whose name will one day be named, to whom the entirety of my authorial activity is dedicated, is my former fiancée, Regina Schlegel." The other undated letter, doubtlessly opened with fear and trembling, was similarly terse. It was a will of sorts, which left all of Søren's possessions to his former fiancée. If Regina refused to accept it for herself, then everything was to go to her so she could distribute it to the poor as she saw fit. "What I wish to express," wrote Søren, "is that for me the engagement was and is just as binding as a marriage."
Now, wait until if you pick up this book, and I very much recommend this book. I greatly enjoyed it. It's very handy to try to get into Kierkegaard, but so again, deeply Christian, yet there's something within Christianity that even in some of the critiques and critics coming from a Jewish and Muslim sector, I very much understand, because within Christ there's this turning. There's always this turning. And again, you see it in Paul with respect to the now and not yet. You see it in Christ that here the Son of God dies on a cross, rises, is raised from the dead to ascend. And I mean, all of this narrative is just, it's on the frontier of chaos and order, one might say.
Søren had left behind another set of instructions, this time regarding his burial site. These papers, dated 1846, listed a set of elaborate details about the placement and decoration of the memorial stone in the family plot. Of particular interest was the poem Søren wished to have engraved on his headstone. "In a little while I shall have won. Then the entire battle will disappear at once. Then I may rest in halls of roses and unceasingly speak with my Jesus."
So again, and the author will make the point in a minute, critic of Christendom, attacker of the church, how scandalous to have his service on a Sunday. You know, his brother, who is a prominent minister of the most important church in the nation, speaks as a brother but not as clergy. Clergy avoid it. You have the scandal of the tomb by a nephew, and then has this, you know, that has the saying for his gravestone that some might get from a cheap plaque from a Christian bookstore, all from the same guy.
Here was a double curiosity. Of all the chatter in the newspapers, all the talk of the town, the wishes of his family, the statements of his friends, and the pronouncements of his enemies, none had settled quite so clearly and simply on the legacy the man himself wished to leave behind. It would seem that this scourge of Christendom died loving Jesus, and the champion of individuality died loving Regina. Let the people say what they wanted about the meaning and purpose of Søren Kierkegaard. No one could deny that his life, indeed, was a singular one.
So that's enough of this for now. It give you a taste of the book and a taste of this man. And very much recommend this conversation. I might play other elements of it. I think I will listen to it again. There's just so much in it of this wrestling to come to terms with what on earth is the Christian life? What does it mean to live it? Is it one lived in the bosom of the church, deeply embedded in a network of loving family and friends, surrounded by an institution which is recognized and, in fact, at least in the United States, protected by the state as such, or in other places like England, promoted by the state, but in a very strange way. And so Christianity has all of these elements to it, and so then to have individuals wrestling with it, can't leave it, can't live without it, how to stand with respect to it, and all of that is right there in Kierkegaard. So I think I'll be continuing to make my way through this audio book as especially it's sort of in preparation. I hope Christopher can make it down to Chino. I don't know if he is, but of course see John at Chino, and I'm sure Kierkegaard will come up in the conversation. So I'll have a link to the book in the notes, so you can pick it up if you want to. I very much recommend it. I found it very helpful after, again, trying to engage with Kierkegaard through his writings. It was tough, and then I read the book and I thought, of course his writings are tough. Look at everything that surrounded the man trying to get your head around this entire world.